welcome back for another episode of Fundy Fridays. If you're new around these parts, my wife, the Reverend Jen, and I, well, on this channel, we talk about things like American conservative politics, evangelical Christianity, pop culture, gay stuff, and the way all those things seem to just bump into each other like scandals piling up around the feet of a megachurch pastor. And speaking of megachurch pastors, today I'm going to be talking about what is perhaps the first ever American megachurch pastor. Hell, maybe the first ever megachurch pastor, depending on who you talk to. Aimee Semple McPherson, or Sister Aimee. Now, the reasons I'm looking to discuss this particular figure from American history today are threefold. Number one, the Reverend is working on something big. It's going to be awesome, but she needs a little bit more time, and this was pretty much ready to go. It was a pet project I'd been sitting on for a bit, so seemed like the right time to release it. Now, the second reason is because we here at Fundy Fridays, or me actually, got the chance recently to speak with Claire Hoffman, the author of the forthcoming book, Sister Sinner, out on April 22nd of this year, 2025. Claire is, in addition to being an incredible author and journalist, one of the world's foremost experts on this particular historic figure, and we just didn't want to pass up the opportunity to chat with her about this important chapter in American religious history. And not to mention to help show off her book to all of you in case you might be interested in reading it yourself once it comes out. But third, I really want to discuss Aimee because I only learned about her recently, and what I discovered was an untold story of American Christian history that I was shocked I had never ever encountered before. Aimee Semple McPherson, put as simply as I can, is a trailblazer of the highest order. There are so many powerful, influential American religious figures who can be directly traced back to the influence of Aimee Semple McPherson. And that's not even counting the fact that the Foursquare church organization that she herself founded still stands to this day, almost 100 years later. But it goes so much deeper than that. She is an early icon of the American megachurch, of the American Pentecostal movement, of the American celebrity pastor, of the American celebrity scandal, to be perfectly honest. And honestly, she's kind of a precursor of all women to take the pulpit after her. And I just really think that she's someone more Americans should be aware of, and particularly someone that our audience here at Fundy Fridays would be particularly interested to know about. Now, to be upfront, most of this video is going to be my interview with Claire, but that's going to come a bit later on. I'd like to lead off with a little intro just so you have some backstory on who Aimee was, why she's interesting, and why you should care about this story. So real quick, I'm going to tell you a short version of the Aimee Semple McPherson story, just so you know what's going on before we jump into our interview. I do also want to highlight, because being a professional creator, I don't always work on my own time frames. I did have an emergency wisdom tooth removal at the beginning of this week. So I'm about 4 days removed from that. My jaw still hurts a little, and I might sound a little funny. Please be gentle with me. I should sound just fine, and unfortunately, I don't always get control of when I do this stuff. But I still feel ready and raring to go. I want you all to hear this story, and to do that, let's just jump right in with Sister Aimee and the very beginning of her story. Now, Aimee Semple McPherson was born sometime in the year 1890 to her mother, Minnie, or Ma Kennedy. Now, for reference, Ma Kennedy was a single teenage mother in the late 1800s in the United States. And I probably don't have to tell you, that was a pretty hard life. And yet, Ma Kennedy was tough. She was a survivor, and she found ways to take care of herself and her daughter, specifically through the Salvation Army religious organization. But it goes a little deeper than that. Ma Kennedy not only dedicated herself, but her infant daughter to the organization and the religious message that it sought to advance, declaring at a Salvation Army temple that she believed her daughter was a prophet of God and someone who was destined to be a great religious leader. She also would work tirelessly for the organization in a variety of roles and earned herself room and board all along the way. Now, eventually, Ma Kennedy would part ways with the Salvation Army, and like most women of the time, would find herself a husband. Now, Ma Kennedy would eventually marry a man named James Kennedy, a minister who was admittedly far too old for her, but all the same, it was the late 1800s and she was doing the best she could. Likewise, James Kennedy would take Ma's daughter, Aimee, under his own religious wing, supplementing the stage mom role that Ma Kennedy herself had for her daughter. But Aimee didn't necessarily start out as a super religious figure, or honestly, very religious at all. In fact, according to Claire's book, she actually went through a pretty noticeable edgy teen atheist kind of phase around 1907, when she herself would have been 17 years old. But very early into that phase, Aimee would be brought back to the faith, and dramatically, after attending a holy roller service, which ironically she apparently first attended just to make fun of, but which in actuality apparently filled her heart with Christ's love and set her on the path that she would follow for the rest of her life. And notably, as part of this process, Aimee would get very into the idea of speaking in tongues, or what Claire mentions in her book is called glossolalia, or prophetic words, depending on whether or not you actually believe they are godly in some capacity.
Mahanda akasata, reke yamanda raboko sokota, ronda yakande eke seke la mama manda rabakase, meta rabakande la babakaso.
And very early on, Aimee started to see herself the way her mother saw her, as a figure of bold, important religious destiny, but also bucking the more humble approach that her mother and the Salvation Army tried to instill in her. By which I mean, Aimee literally convinced her own mother of her important religious destiny, leading them both to break away from the Salvation Army and start their own religious movement entirely around 1907 or so. Now again, like most women of the time, Aimee would move from here to find a husband very young. Aimee would go on to marry, in fact, the pastor of that Holy Roller revival that invigorated her with the Spirit, a young Irishman by the name of Robert James Semple. And to be fair, in the pictures I've seen, which by the way, Claire's book has a whole glossy section of beautiful photos. They are black and white because that's all they had access to at the time, but still glossy and gorgeous. But from what I've seen of the photos, I get why Aimee was smitten with this dude. Robert was, for all intents and purposes, a hot Irish guy, pretty close to Aimee's age for the time, very charismatic, and very Christian.
Oh no, he's hot!
And very shortly after marrying, the two would embark on a whirlwind romance, by which I mean a revival tour of Hong Kong. And this revival tour would last from 1908 until about 1910, when tragedy would strike the couple in the form of malaria. Now, both Robert and Aimee would contract the disease, and unfortunately, the disease would take Robert's life, but not Aimee's, and in fact, she was pregnant at the time and still gave birth to the couple's first child shortly after Robert's death, her daughter, rightly named Roberta. And from there, around September of 1910, Aimee would relocate to New York with her mother and daughter. Now, very early on in her move to New York, Aimee would meet a man by the name of Harold McPherson, a local accountant and very quickly a suitor of Aimee's, as the two would start dating basically after the moment they met. Now, unlike her late husband Robert, it seems like Harold was a bit older than Aimee, and to be perfectly honest, seems like, to me at least, kind of an aggressively normal guy who would kind of position Aimee as his own little manic pixie preacher girl after seeing her play tambourine at a local tent revival. In Sister Sinner, we actually find out that Harold wanted to quote-unquote change any girl he was with and to make her forget the profound sadness of her past, which to me is just kind of ugh.
Ew! Get off of me! Ugh, as if!
But apparently this did enough to convince Aimee of Harold's suitable status as a second husband, as she would go on to marry him in 1911, although notably it seems with a fair amount less enthusiasm than she had when she married Robert. Reportedly, Aimee even told Harold up front that God and the church would always take precedent over her marriage, over him, over anything, and Harold accepted those terms. That being said, though, Aimee did, for a little while it seems, try to live the domestic housewife life. She would give birth to her second child, her son Rolf, in 1913, and would spend time as a literal desperate housewife across both Chicago and Rhode Island before deciding that she would go crazy if she was not allowed to preach again. A demand that, once again, her husband Harold acquiesced to, leading to the couple to drop their children off with family, specifically Ma Kennedy again, before moving on together to a life of traveling evangelism in 1917, first taking the state of Florida by storm, which I gotta say, from what I learned in Sister Center, was kind of crazy. Apparently in 1917, in one moment in history, Aimee shared the traveling preaching circuit of Florida with both famed occultist Aleister Crowley and also legendary baseball player turned preacher Billy Sunday, both of whom were touring the same area at the same time as Aimee Semple McPherson. And going on with those kind of theatrics, Aimee specialized at this point in her life in faith healing limping or otherwise sick parishioners before crowds of flabbergasted and devoted onlookers, and apparently claiming to have cured hundreds of people of hundreds of diseases over the course of her life. Now, one thing that Aimee figured out very quickly didn't work for her was this marriage to Harold McPherson, which she would end in 1918 very dramatically by leaving him in Florida, taking the kids, reuniting with her mother, and running off to California, clear on the other side of the country, to start her own solo preaching career. And let me tell you, Aimee took to California like a roaring 20s version of Chapel Roan, treating the sunny West Coast as a fresh start and a new homeland that understood her. Seriously, she even wrote her own song about how great California was. I wasn't kidding about that Chapel Roan comparison. For her part, though, Aimee would start her career in California guest preaching at Pentecostal churches all across the state. And notably, it was at this time in her life where Aimee first started getting paid to preach. She also started developing her own unique style on the pulpit at this time too. Swishy white robes and holy imagery designed to invoke old-time chastity and religiosity. And this was also where the Sister Aimee title would first come to fruition, keeping her notably relatable even as her crowds got bigger and bigger. And Aimee's bombastic, loving style of preaching, well, it got her a devoted following very quickly.
There was a joy 1,000 times magnified since Jesus the Lord came in. Can you say amen too? Thank God 'tis true. Then suddenly this man began to speak in another tongue as the Spirit gave him utterance. And I had never heard anything like that. And my eyes flew open. I just sat and looked at him. And to me it was as though God said, "You are a poor, lost, miserable sinner." Ooh, I said, "Daddy, let's get out of here." I said, "I thought you wanted to come here." I said, "I do, but I want to leave now." How I ever got through the rehearsal at the town hall that night.
By 1919, just 1 year after arriving in the state of California, Aimee had already amassed a congregation which donated to her not only land on which to build a home, but also the labor and materials needed to build a house on that land, which her congregation also did for her. Literally, this woman had been preaching for a year, and she got a donation of land and then a house being built on that land.
It's free real estate.
Now from here, Aimee would take herself to sunny San Diego in 1921, and more importantly, would begin preaching out of an old boxing arena. What's more, she would take advantage of this newer, bigger space by adding a significant amount of production value to her preaching, with more props, more effects, more stage production, all fueled by that same romantic, fiery pastoral style she carried everywhere. And from there, the same year in 1921, Aimee would go on to form the Echo Park Evangelistic Association. And just a year later, in 1922, would found the Foursquare Gospel Association, the organization that would come to be her true legacy. Now, I'm really not going to get into the Foursquare Church today because we've had a lot of folks request it on Fundy Fridays in the past, and it's kind of a whole big thing of its own. And who knows, now we may cover it someday on down the road, but suffice it to say, the name Foursquare comes from the four main pillars of the organization, which were themselves started by Aimee. That's all you really need to know for the purposes of today. But what is important for the purposes of our story today is the founding of the Angelus Temple in 1923, actually on New Year's Day of 1923. Arguably the first ever American megachurch. For reference, the Angelus temple cost $6 million in today's money and was heavily inspired by Roman architecture, with a sparkling concrete dome complete with crushed abalone shells, a large stage for Aimee to preach her heart out from, and even marble columns for that extra touch of class.
You gotta get yourself some marble columns.
And as you might expect, with this kind of arena at her disposal, Aimee would go even further with the dramatic theatrics than she did in the old boxing arena. But we'll get to that in Claire's interview, just hold on, it's wild. Still though, Aimee's ambition wasn't just related to the pulpit or the stage either, because it was around this time where she also first founded the Life Bible College, a seminary school designed specifically to train up new Foursquare pastors in Aimee's very specific style of preaching. What's more, just a year later in 1924, Aimee would go on to found the Call Foursquare Gospel radio station, in fact becoming the first American woman to ever receive her own radio license. And starting an affair with her radio operator, though, once again, talk about that later. Because what's important to know now is that Aimee was, put simply, making money hand over fist. Tens of thousands of dollars, and bear in mind, that's tens of thousands of dollars in 1920s money. That's not necessarily adjusted for inflation. Every single week in donations from her thousands of adoring congregants. And naturally, as you might expect, her public profile would grow more and more and more by the day. And what's more, this is where things take a real weird turn in the story. Now, I'm going to be perfectly honest, this is the part I'm summing up the most, and this is the stuff you really need to read Claire's book for. Now, long story made very short, in the summer of 1926, Aimee would cap off a day of writing her sermons with a swim in the Pacific Ocean, one of her favorite hobbies. But unfortunately, she would not come back out of the ocean, and at this point, many folks assumed she had just been carried away by the riptide and drowned. Although thousands of her congregants would gather on the beaches to try and look for her, and eventually folks would just move on to mourning the lost pastor. Before she would show up out of nowhere 600 miles away and 35 days later in the deserts of Mexico. What's more, Aimee claimed that she had actually been kidnapped, specifically by a, you can't make this up, group of people calling themselves the Avengers, who were apparently a bunch of low-life criminals looking to punish Aimee for her godly behavior and activities. Aimee reported that she was taken to Mexico, held in a little rickety wooden shack, tortured with a burning cigar, before eventually escaping the shack under even more mysterious circumstances and walking several days through the desert without food or water. Now, notably, no one was able to find any proof that this actually happened. No proof that the Avengers actually existed, none of it. And eventually, Aimee was brought up on fraud charges for the emerging scandal. LA prosecutors would work really hard to poke holes in Aimee's story while never actually getting themselves organized enough to do anything about it. And yet, Aimee spent a lot of the time in the trial process not helping herself at all, bringing in a bunch of random witnesses like a blind lawyer and a mentally ill congregant of hers who looked a lot like Aimee but also apparently spoke for a mysterious sister that no one ever met before, well, read the book. And in turn, though, a lot of media attention was paid to relatively trivial and, quite frankly, sexist matters, as one might expect, like the apparently immodest bright green swimsuit that Aimee was wearing the day she disappeared, and whether or not Aimee's ankles were thick enough to be noticeable to the average observer. Now, I want to save some mystery for those of you who read the book, but there is a lot of belief nowadays that Aimee might have used this whole kidnapping story to cover up some less than holy behavior on her part at the time. And seriously, if you are a person who likes courtroom theatrics and surprise, dramatic legal gestures, you have got to read this. The author Claire even actually got significant amounts of never-before-seen documentation and testimony related to this case. It's basically a real-life noir crime drama. But what is important to know is that the combined weight of all these scandals would see a dramatic turn in Aimee's public profile towards the negative. And what's more, would also see her fall out pretty intensely with both her mother, Ma Kennedy, and her daughter, Roberta. with Ma Kennedy's departure from Aimee's management team being a particularly big problem, allowing a parade of manipulative men to come in and seize more and more control over the Foursquare organization and the Angelus Temple from Aimee as time went on. Don't get it twisted though, moving into the 1930s, Aimee still held a significant public profile, and did end up managing a kind of pseudo-revival of her public image, ironically by leaning into the celebrity Hollywood lifestyle and image that she'd been criticized for in the past. She started hanging out with movie stars, wore more glamorous jewelry and clothes, and even bobbed her hair, which at the time was a huge deal. At the same time, Aimee just wasn't collecting as much money as she used to, in no small part likely due to her glamorous new lifestyle and appearance, and would end up taking on greater amounts of debt both to maintain the Angelus Temple, but also just her lifestyle at large. And that's not even to note the great financial crash of 1929 and the subsequent Great Depression, which would only make things worse for Aimee. And, well, the rest of the country too, but also Aimee. Likewise though, Aimee's preaching became, for lack of better phrasing, more and more self-indulgent over time, pointing all of that production value at just kind of retelling different parts of her own life over and over and expressing how holy and destined she was. Aimee would even attempt to start Angelus Productions, her own movie studio, between 1929 and 1930, although, as you might expect, and especially given that time in American history, this endeavor did not go very well, and was also further not helped by her third marriage, specifically this time to powerhouse actor David Hutton. A marriage which I will leave the details of to my interview with Claire and those of you who eventually end up reading her book, but suffice it to say, this quickie celebrity marriage would end in absolute flames and only serve to further damage Aimee's tarnished reputation. And from here, it would be an unfortunate and long decline to the end. Throughout the 1930s and moving into even the early 1940s, Aimee would cede more and more control of both her empire and her fortune to various lawyers and supposed caregivers, with a powerful guardian named Giles Knight taking over almost every aspect of her life for a long time. And eventually, all of this decline would culminate in Aimee's death in 1944 from what appears to have been an overdose of sleeping pills. But all the same, and even though things didn't end as glamorously as they started, Aimee left behind an incredible legacy. First of all, there were her two incredibly successful children, Roberta and Rolf. While Roberta never took over Foursquare the way her mother wanted to, she did end up with her mother's knack for media production, and would end up working on some classic TV shows, most notably Name That Tune, whereas Rolf actually would become Aimee's eventual successor at the Foursquare organization, a role he would maintain for over 40 years, well into the 1980s. Likewise, even as Aimee's own profile declined, the Foursquare Church itself would continue to grow and grow, and to this day boasts thousands of churches and millions of practitioners worldwide. And so yeah, that's Aimee in a real short nutshell. A woman with a very deep and very modern, if not also very troubled, legacy. An early pioneer of megachurch theatrics, prosperity gospel, and celebrity pastor scandal, but also at the same time a pioneer for women preachers and religious leaders. Decades ahead of her time in so many ways. And so with that, I would like to take you all on to my interview with Sister Sinner author Claire Hoffman. Hello, everyone, and welcome back for another Fundy Fridays interview. I know I say it every time, but it is true every time. I am so excited to bring you today's guest, in no small part because I think we have, at least in my opinion, the world's foremost expert on the particular subject we're going to be talking about today. We are joined by author Claire Hoffman, who recently wrote the book Sister Sinner, which we will be discussing today, and which covers the life and times of Foursquare Church founder, among many, many other accolades and scandals and things, Aimee Semple McPherson. So, Claire, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with me today.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. This is going to be
Wonderful.
fun.
Oh, it is. It's funny because we hadn't heard anything about Aimee before we started this process with you, and what a story it is. I'm shocked more people don't know more about her and that she's not kind of a household name at this point. But I'm going to leave some of that to you. I don't want to give away too much because that's kind of the whole point of the story is that this is a very fascinating, twisty, turny tale. Also, kind of I would call it cloaked in a lot of 1920s noir. There's kind of a very, I don't know, the whole story felt very Art Deco to me, I will say.
Totally.
So I don't want to give away too much. But before we jump into everything about Ms. McPherson, Sister Aimee, whatever we want to call her for today, I'd like to ask a little bit more about your background. I know you yourself come from kind of a fascinating story that probably influenced your decision to cover this topic in particular. Would you mind telling us just a little bit about your life and career and what led you to this moment?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so many things led me to this moment, but I'm a writer and a journalist, and I've worked in newspapers and magazines for 2 decades. And my first book was about the kind of spiritual community that I grew up in a small town in the Midwest. And my parents were part of the Transcendental Meditation movement. So I grew up in this new religious movement, so to speak, of people who were spending 3 to 4 hours a day meditating. I went to a school called the Maharishi School of the Age of Enlightenment. I learned to meditate when I was 3 years old, and I had my meditations graded in school. So I come from like a very strong belief community, and left that when I was a teenager and had all the sort of anger and nihilism and bitterness that one has when leaving a strong belief community, and you start to see the cracks in it. I ended up getting a master's degree in religion at divinity school, and that's where I first learned about Aimee. And I just will say the other piece of that is, as a journalist, I covered religion, but I also, I worked for Rolling Stone, and I covered a lot of celebrities, and I started to just see a lot of overlap in these stories and this behavior between kind of charismatic gurus like the one that I grew up with and these, celebrities who were often melting down. So yeah, that's kind of the road to Aimee.
Well, that makes sense. And I will say that is one of the things that, and I'm going to desperately try, y'all, to not give spoilers. We're trying to encourage everyone to read Claire's book or check it out from your local library, request it at your local library, whatever it may be. But I will say one of the things that really struck me when I was reading Sister Sinner was just how modern Aimee's story felt, how uncomfortably modern at times Aimee's story felt. And so I guess I know we just talked a little bit about what drew you to kind of where you wrote about her, but what about Aimee in particular made you feel like this was a story you needed to tell, that this is something I should really seize on to? What was it about her?
It's a evolving story. I will say, just because I think it's sort of interesting to your audience. I mean, the community that I grew up in was like kind of quasi Hindu, right? Like lots of Indian sort of stuff. Obviously that's not what my parents grew up as. But as soon as I went to college, I was really interested in born again religion and Pentecostalism in particular, and evangelical Christianity. And I think that I saw a lot of like parallels in terms of community and belief system, in terms of like what I had been through and what I was seeing, like just this complete other world aspect of people who were a part of it, in the way that I grew up in this like bubble of belief. And, I mean, evangelical Christians are, it's just so much bigger, like mine was so weird and niche and small. So I always was interested. And then I had learned about Aimee in divinity school, and I kind of wondered why I hadn't heard of her, to your point. Like, she was a household name for decades. Every American would have known who she was in 1920s America, and probably 1930s and even 1940s America, but she'd been kind of erased. But I didn't know about her scandal. And I learned about that when I was living in Los Angeles, and I was getting really into ocean swimming. And I learned that Aimee disappeared in 1926 swimming by herself in the Pacific Ocean. And that just kind of blew my mind that this like really important, somewhat erased religious figure in American history who was a woman was swimming alone in the Pacific, you know, like a place I wouldn't normally swim by myself. So then I was just like, I gotta find out who this woman was. You know, there's like this kind of wild cowboy aspect to her almost. You know what I mean? Like that's just, as you said, it's so modern and it's so bold. And then I found out about the scandal and I was like, I think this is my book.
Yeah, it's such a, I mean, I don't want to say Great Gatsby because it feels too obvious, but there is such just like it's too strange to be fiction. Like just such a weird element about her case. And my thought was that they found her again. Usually the sea takes someone, it takes somebody, but no.
Yeah, just 600 miles away.
Aimee found her way out of there.
Yeah, she did. Yeah.
Under whatever circumstances they may have been. Read the book.
Yeah.
And I will say that part of your work as a journalist in covering this story is that you were really able to get, I mean, I know the phrase unprecedented access is kind of thrown around a lot, but in this situation, it really applies. You got access to some incredible records, some stuff that had been locked away for decades as you were researching the story, meaning that in Sister Center, people are getting new information about a case that's close to or gonna be 100 years old very soon. But can you tell us a little bit about this just particularly special access you got and how you were able to find all this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, it was a lot of legwork and time, to be honest. Do a quick overview. I don't think this ruins the book at all. Like it's all so crazy. Like
even if we told you how it ended and what the story was, I can guarantee you we aren't going to tell you all of the weird paths and twists and turns of how you get there.
No, there's stuff in there that still blows my mind. So Aimee, you know, at the height of her fame in May of 1926, goes down to the ocean and she's working on a sermon. I think it's important to note that the sermon she was working on was entitled Light and Darkness. And she, you know, drew a little sun and she was sort of writing about like the shadows of the world and sin and, you know, these kind of concepts of the polarities between people. And she takes a break, she walks into the ocean and she disappears. And, you know, can I say that all hell broke loose? Like all hell broke loose. She was, you know, the most famous woman in the city. 2 people died looking for her. 40,000 people gathered on the shore to search for her and to pray for her return. It was, you know, national news, even global news that she had disappeared. And 35 days later, she walks in from the deserts of Mexico, 600 miles away from Los Angeles, with a incredible story of having been kidnapped, allegedly into what she called white slavery, by a group of people from the underworld who she said had specifically targeted her. And she, you know, has run through the desert for miles and miles through day and through night. And she miraculously, you know, has escaped. And she returns to Los Angeles and there's a grand jury investigation into who these kidnappers are. And very quickly, the grand jury investigation turns into these questions about who Aimee is, what her private life was, and kind of, you know, almost building a case from the prosecutor's office that she had faked the whole thing. And there's a second series of charges filed against her. Her mother, who was sort of this like Kris Jenner momager type, her alleged lover, who was her radio operator, and a schizophrenic doppelganger who she allegedly hired to impersonate her. It's a whole crazy, you know, so there's actually 2 court inquiries into this that become a global news story. It's the most expensive court proceeding in LA's history until the Manson murders. Like it's just this epic cost to the city. It absolutely captivates the city. So you think about like OJ or the Manson murders in terms of its scale. But when I went to go get the court records from, you know, what they call like the tombs down in the underground world of downtown Los Angeles, there was only 14 pages. And I spent the next couple of years looking like everywhere, you know, whether it was in the law library, the district attorney's files, you know, different attorneys that had been associated with it. it, and there was no surviving copy except the Foursquare church had one. But her son, Rolf, who took over from Aimee for decades, had a copy, and he had said he never wanted journalists to have access to it. He felt that journalists had been really unfair to his mother in her lifetime, which is, I think, a fair critique, although, probably a little more complicated, but, I also understand like a son feeling that way. And I wrote a letter to the Foursquare board, and about a year later, they said yes and shared them with me. They were redacted, I should say.
And I will highlight that the Foursquare Church, which is a commonly requested topic here on Fundy Fridays, was, I'm not getting into Foursquare necessarily because they're a whole other story unto themselves, but they were founded by Aimee Semple McPherson back in the 20s and are still around to this day.
Back in the 20s, our founder, Aimee Semple McPherson, began referring to the message of the gospel as being Foursquare, which back in the day meant solid and balanced.
Well, and that's incredible to me also that they were the ones maintaining those court records too.
Yeah, they have a huge archive of her things, a subterranean archive that they have kept. And, I remember saying to the archivist, who was amazing and incredibly helpful to me, I've tried everything I can to get these trial transcripts. They're nowhere. There's no surviving copies. And he's like, oh, I have it right here. And he pulled it up on his computer and was kind of like, oh, don't get too close. Don't look. And I was like, oh, like but they didn't just hand it over to me, I should say. Like there were strings.
Now, I am curious because, obviously one of the big things about Aimee's story, I think, that's just fascinating kind of on its face is to see a woman leading a religious organization of this size and going back to, the Roaring '20s. While, we know that things were improving and that there was social progress taking place in that era, it's still kind of surprising to hear that, a woman led the largest individual church in Los Angeles. Do you see Aimee as kind of a precursor to maybe like modern, women megachurch pastors like a Joyce Myers or maybe a Paula White, that type? And if so, like how do you see her influence reflected in kind of the stuff you're seeing today?
I think her influence is bigger than that. Like I think it's weird, frankly, that most Americans know who Billy Graham is and they don't know who Aimee Semple McPherson is. She was Billy Graham before Billy Graham, but I would argue, almost because she was a woman and because of the scandal, she's been kind of erased from history in some ways. In terms of being a woman at that time, it's just a real incredible story. She built the first church, the Angelus Temple, which is arguably the first megachurch in America, in 1923. And she did that with her mother, and they built it entirely through what they called love offerings, donations. And they built it bit by bit, with money that they raised in these giant tent revivals around the country. And yeah, it's something like 3 years after, women have been given the right to vote, so it's just, the timing is incredible to build this huge institution that remains today. I think what's a little bit of a bummer, in reading about it, and as you said, like how modern it feels, is that I think Aimee almost felt unencumbered in a way that you don't see many women feel now. And that part of it is like the singularity of her personality. She felt deeply chosen for the work that she was doing. She had a sense of purpose and ambition that is like truly bottled lightning. There's not many people who feel so correct in their decisions all the time. And she really did. She really believed in herself. Her mother really believed in herself. When she was born, her mother said that she had been divinely chosen. Her mother had been a Salvation Army suffragette, so to speak, at the very beginning of that movement. And so there's a lot of that energy. But in terms of the legacy, Aimee, I think, helped shape pretty much what we think of today as Christian entertainment. You know, she had these illustrated sermons that she did that were really kind of cutting edge at the time, where she would do these giant productions on stage, like almost kind of bringing vaudeville or early Hollywood into the gospel, which was not something that was happening. You know, she would have set decorators and costume designers and musicians from Hollywood come and reenact the gospel. And it became like a huge attraction in Los Angeles. I mean, people from Hollywood would come to the Angelus Temple to see it. I think also just like in general, her sense of drama and presentation.
You're drifting away from the faith of your fathers. You're drifting away from prayer, drifting away from the Bible reading, drifting away from the family altar, and only ruin and a heartbreak and a home break lay in the direction of backsliding. I am coming out to help bring you back, if I can, to the fold. Give me a burden for souls, Lord. Give me a love for the lost. Let my heart bleed as thine own, Lord. Give me a burden for souls.
Her kind of, I mean, there is some prosperity doctrine there that you see that Aimee is shaping. So much of that kind of theatricality and performance and a sense of packaging for the masses. I mean, Aimee was one of the first women to be on the radio. She started one of the first Christian radio stations, which had reach, around the country. So just the scale of her operation is something that you see a lot of people imitate down the line. And then, yes, like when I look at Paula White, it's hard for me not to think about Aimee. There's so much there. So, but I would just argue, I think evangelical America is very much shaped by Aimee and her sense of mass, her sense of mega, her sense of performance, and kind of, like manifesting desire, which was a huge part of her life.
No, I know one of the questions I had on my list was like, who do you think she most looks like in terms of like, is there a modern parallel? But it's so hard with her because there's little bits of Aimee Semple in everybody. Once you learn the story, the prosperity and the size of a Joel Osteen, kind of that West Coast kind of like the West Coast coolness of like a Carl Lentz or maybe a Sean Foyt. And then obviously the one I always came back to was Paula White, just because between the speaking in tongues and just being kind of a thin white woman in white clothing up on the stage, just working an audience to within an inch of their lives.
Because the only way you overcome evil is good. Come on, the only good in you is God. The only way God can move is to get you to move. The only way this thing can work is your obedience in the name of Jesus, and that is the spiritual warfare.
I mean, it's just hard to pick who she's most like, because I think all three of them can be directly traced back to this one individual source. Be it her, be it the Angelus Temple, which the way you describe in the book, I swear it sounds otherworldly. It's such a weird thing when you figure out that the most entertaining thing in 20s Hollywood was a church. It's just remarkable, and I don't even want to ask you who she looks most like, because I think she kind of looks like all of them.
Yeah, and she also changed the way she looked. She had plastic surgery, and after she became really famous, she went on a bunch of diets and became more blonde. She sort of physically transformed. But yeah, I mean, the Angelus Temple is like, I think such a cool thing to think about is like this moment when all these people are moving to California from the Midwest and the South and the East Coast with this hope of kind of reinventing themselves. And it's this moment of like urbanization and industrialization. And Aimee builds this like temple that is supposed to make them feel like they're at once, in the most magnificent royal place in the world, but also that feeling of being out on the prairie or in the Everglades in an outdoor revival, right? Like she had the ceiling she used these crushed seashells in the ceiling to make it sparkle and give you the sense that you're like under the clouds. I mean, she was such a romantic in that sense, and in other senses. But yeah, so you feel like she was this kind of perfect balm for these people who were coming in and kind of probably not living in particularly great situations in, dawning of like Los Angeles as a city, but this was a place they could come and feel kind of elevated, but also connected back to, this kind of primordial, magical rural space.
And I know that one of the other kind of, I don't know if I'd call it one of the major things she was a predecessor to, she's predecessor to so much, was just the incredible production value we see in modern megachurches. We've talked about like the James River Men's Conference with its monster trucks and things like that. Do you have a there were a lot, it seems like, too, of stories of her kind of extravagance on stage. Do you have any that you think stand out in particular? Maybe a little sample of kind of the indulgence or the just incredible, awesomeness, for lack of better phrasing, of her stage show? Maybe your favorite story?
I mean, yeah, there are a lot, and she was sort of legendary for it. And the insult from her critics was always like, "Oh, she should have been in Hollywood. She should have been an actress," right? Like that was kind of the knock on her almost. But I mean, she had camels on her stage, she had lions, she had horses. I mean, it was epic. It was always just riveting. I love the story about her where she's driving with her daughter and she gets pulled over for speeding by a motorcycle cop. And she's like, okay, just give me the ticket. I'm having an idea, and she goes back and she actually brings a motorcycle. She dresses up as a cop that night and takes a motorcycle onto the stage and, hits the siren and gives this sermon about being arrested for speeding through life and kind of missing its meaning and not living correctly according to the gospel. And she puts it all on the stage, which was like a little bit almost the trick about her as a biographer, so to speak, where there's not a lot of like personal records, right? Like there's not a lot of letters, and what the people from the archives said is like, everything just went on the stage, it went in the magazine. It was like, if she had a thought, it was not for private consumption, it was for the public. Like she was just a mass messenger. That was her thing.
And I was glad you brought up the motorcycle. I was going to say that was my favorite. And I'm like, I bet we might have a same favorite. It's such a bombastic story. 50-cent ticket, $10,000 in donations off the story alone. That's the type of thing she could do. And she was doing it in the 20s. Like, it's just unbelievable.
Yeah, you would never see a woman in pants, let alone like in a cop uniform on a motorcycle. I mean, that's the thing to always kind of remember with her, is like just how revolutionary it was.
Absolutely. I am curious, because one of the things that's also very interesting about Aimee is that, I mean, she was revolutionary, definitely, but she also really was revolutionary in no small part because of how much she appealed to old-time religion and old values and things like that. And I am curious how you would feel. Now, obviously, you're not her, and unfortunately, we can't ask Aimee anything, but I am curious what you think she might feel about, like, the modern trad wife movement that we're seeing now, of trying to encourage women to be quiet again and take less of a leadership role and cede more territory to their husbands. It's certainly old-timey, but I also just can't help but feel like Ms. McPherson, Sister Aimee, would have a lot of opinions about that. What do you think she would say about all these trad wives running around?
It's such a good question. I have to tell you, I loved your Ballerina Farm episode. I follow her and I'm always like, I don't understand what I'm seeing. Can someone explain this to me? Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and it's actually like a question that kind of comes up in the book because it's, I mean, she's doing everything she's doing during this like sort of first wave feminism and the suffrage movement, and she did not support those things outwardly. And this is like where she's kind of tricky as a protagonist because she believed in herself. She believed totally in her ability to do these things. And she was a real supporter of women. Like there were a lot of women who came to her temple and who she helped take care of. And she had a real sense of women's issues. She took care of a lot of women who were like young pregnant mothers or had been abused. Like that was definitely part of her ministry. But she was not political on that stuff. She did not come out and speak, like for women's rights in that sense. And she was a fundamentalist Christian, right? So she was kind of slippery. So the answer, I think, would be that she would be slippery about it. There's no way Aimee would support women being silent, right? Like this was a woman who was accused her entire life of being too loud. She wouldn't be supportive of it, but I think she was very artful in that way, so to speak, of like addressing these things without addressing them or doing like a workaround. She just had a complicated history of kind of being enmeshed with maybe political figures that retrospectively were not so good. I mean, she had like the Ku Klux Klan had a weird obsession with her, but she also had like a really strong early outreach to the African American community. So like it's like she had a lot of juxtaposition. So I don't know what she would think about trad wife. She was never a trad wife. She was married 3 times. She definitely wore the pants in the family, as they would say. She was a powerful woman. And, she was supported by her mother, who was a powerful woman. She really always wanted to pass the church on to her daughter. So she believed strongly in this like kind of powerful matriarchy, but she was careful about criticizing sort of fundamentalist conservative Christianity. I don't think she would ever use those words submit, right? I mean, this is part of the book, like her second marriage, she tried to become somewhat maybe like a traditional housewife, and she actually like lost her mind. Like she had a complete nervous breakdown. She ended up in the hospital, and she writes kind of beautifully about like the sound of the tea kettle and like people saying like, why won't you just polish the floors, and you really feel that kind of trappedness. I mean, a contemporary biographer of hers called her a flamingo in a chicken coop, which I thought was kind of perfect.
Please, I'm a star!
Now, you've made reference to a few people here. There's one figure other than Aimee herself, I think, who's kind of like an obvious secondary figure / sidekick in the book. But are there any other characters in this story in particular that you found interesting? This was very much her whole life, and the book itself feels kind of like a stage play. There's characters moving in and out. They're all very dramatic in their own unique ways. Who are some of the other folks in the book that maybe you would tell readers, keep an eye on this person?
Yeah, I mean, the first and most obvious one is her mother. I mean, there's a way in which this whole book is actually a mother-daughter story. And that's a tricky one, but, you see it just from the moment Aimee's born, her and her mother are kind of like locked in with each other. And her mother's story about who Aimee is and who she's meant to be becomes both prophetic and also, I think, a cage. There were people who observed during her kidnapping scandal that Aimee just seemed to be totally directly focused on, like, did her mother believe her? And this is a very famous, very successful woman who is also living in a tiny 2-bedroom apartment with her mother and is just totally focused on like her mother's opinion of her. And at the same time, I think probably rebelling against her mother. So that, Minnie is just an incredible character. I wish I'd had more material on her because I would love to know her thoughts. But, what I have reflects like a pretty complicated position. And then Kenneth Ormiston, who is her alleged lover and her radio operator, is, just so fantastic, kind of 1920s noir, like a World War I victim with a limp who doesn't appear particularly handsome, but apparently was like a real ladies' man and was sort of the one person in Aimee's world who didn't treat her like a living saint, like treated her like a regular person, which I think did have incredible power over her. I mean, I think she really liked that. Yeah, and then there's the schizophrenic doppelganger Lorraine. I mean, that one, I'm just like, you got to read the book. It's so crazy. You're almost like, oh, this is where noir comes from, like this kind of crazy tableau. And I mean, besides the court transcripts, I mean, I spent so much time in like the newspapers of the day, and it's just a wild world. My favorite character, though, besides the ones mentioned, is this blind lawyer. I loved him. I feel like I had to be like careful not to make like the whole sort of middle section actually about him, but
he kind of has a plot twist stapled onto his role in the story.
Oh my gosh, that's what, I mean, he has an untimely death. Let's just say that you're like, what? Like, was he like sort of rubbed out? Like, what happened? It's the weirdest death story ever. But yeah, that he's considered the single witness to Aimee's kidnappers, but he's blind. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. So
ironically, you listed several characters, and they weren't, just to give you all an idea, they weren't even the people I was thinking of when I wrote the question, because my brain always goes to, I absolutely love, I believe it was Bob Schuler, which
yes,
Aimee's professional gadfly, her professional hater, her op, who made his whole career, it seems like, just being less popular and angry at Aimee.
Yes, fighting Bob, Aimee, and then there's another preacher who worked for her that becomes disenfranchised, who wrote a kind of burn book about her called Aimee the Gospel Gold Digger, who has like private detectives follow her at night.
And then I also have to mention, this was also your book also inadvertently introduced me to Tex Guinan for the first time.
Oh, yes.
That was someone I'd never heard of, like a blonde bombshell speakeasy owner of the 20s, like a weird frenemy of Aimee's for a little while was the only way I could describe it. It felt like they kind of liked each other and got each other, but they existed on opposite sides of the world. I want you to know I wrote in my notes about that section, all I wrote for those two was brat coded, because I was like, I'm just like, this is so Lord and Charlie. That's all
it is. It literally is. This is like the exciting thing about publishing a book, is that I get to like actually talk to other people, and that is exactly what it is. I mean, she says something like, Aimee's got her racket and I've got mine, or something like that. It's totally brat coded. Thank you. Let's work it out on the remix.
It's one of those moments when I'm reading your book, I'm just like, it gets to her going to talk to Tex and visiting the speakeasy again, read the book. I won't tell you how that all goes. But when she walks into the speakeasy, I'm just like, this can't be real. This is such a movie. I can just literally imagine the whole place just stopping.
And it's like, and they've got like maybe a 17-year-old girl dancing kind of nude, and Aimee's like, watching, and then gives like maybe the sermon of her life afterwards to all the drunks, it's, and that's like all in the newspaper,
And like a Thursday for her. Like, because she's gonna do that, and the next day she's gonna roll out of bed and preach before 5,000 people with a lion next to her. It's something else. So I do have to ask, I'm just curious, can we reference this a little bit more? I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but I am curious. The kidnapping scandal, do you think she was? Do you think she was? Do you think maybe she was hiding something? Or maybe it's just a pure mystery best left to time? What do you think?
I'll be honest, like the kidnapping, it's really interesting. Like, it's more interesting than it seems. It's not just like, was it a hoax or was it not a hoax? Because I feel like I live in a world where people believe really different things and exist in really different realities, right? I mean, I really felt it during the pandemic. People just saw the world really differently, and some of it's political, some of it's experiential, whatever's happening. And I actually feel like sort of living through the pandemic, and that's, when I was like working on the book and finishing it, it was like, wow, I mean, people, there is not actually a shared reality, like you can really live in totally different worlds in the same place. And with Aimee, I think she believed her own story. I will say that. I think she told that story almost exactly the same until the day she died. And I think she believed it. And I think she, before the kidnapping episode, had a real understanding of herself as a conjurer and a person who interpreted the unseen and the unknown. And so she was of course a performer, but she was also a storyteller and a person who, kind of had that feeling of somebody who was taking the unseen and making it seen for people. And so I see a lot of that in this story. And I would say for readers, for me, I would say keep an eye on that wristwatch, because that's what was really the turning point for me. She's got a wristwatch that her mother gave her, and that was sort of my aha moment. So keep an eye on that watch.
The prosecutors kept their eyes on her stupid ankles. That was what drove me up a wall.
That's the thing. It's like, oh, you know, was she a huckster or a grifter or whatever? And you're like, maybe, but also like, look at these assholes who are trying to prosecute her and going through her underwear and her corset and taking apart her life and taking apart her belief systems, taking apart her body and her hair. It's like, you know, everyone's kind of awful, you know? So that's what I mean by these different realities. Like those prosecutors thought they were doing, you know, the work of justice, but 100 years later, you're like, ugh, it's reprehensible, you know?
More attention paid to how thick her ankles were and the color of the swimsuit.
Yeah, the ankles.
They were mean to her. I felt bad. I know she was powerful, but it made me feel bad.
No, you feel bad. And you see her, you know, she ends up with kind of body dysmorphia after it. Like yeah, it's messed up. Like, I feel for her.
I know this isn't in your book and may not be your area of expertise, but there was, just to let our audience know, and I'll put a little bit up on screen, but there was a 2012 Broadway stage production written by Kathy Lee Gifford of Regis and Kathy Lee fame about Aimee's life. It was called Scandalous. And apparently it was also a bit of a scandal at Foursquare because they invested a little bit of ill-advised money into the project alongside Betsy DeVos in one of the only times she ever got involved in a Broadway production. I've learned since that Betsy DeVos and her husband donate a lot of money to the arts, but this was one of the only times they ever got involved in a stage play, a Broadway play. Do you know anything about this play? I have to ask.
I mean, I know mostly what you know. I know all of that. I know Kathy Lee worked on it for a long time, and I believe that she is a member of the Foursquare Church, but I could be wrong. But I do think if she was not a member, she was closely tied, and she's a believer. And yeah, that's what I know. I mean, every generation has kind of, since Aimee's death, has kind of played around with her. So there's a great Frank Capra movie that's based on Aimee called The Miracle Woman, which is,
I'm learning of it right now.
Grace of our Lord be with you all. Amen. Amen. Dearly beloved, all you meek of the earth, all you that labor and are heavy laden, I come here to lift the heavy loads from your heart.
It's great. It's a very negative view of Aimee. There's people who say Elmer Gantry in part is about Aimee.
I've been doing what most of you have been doing. Farming. Milking the cows, lying in the clover, and letting the joy of God's nature flow into my heart. And here's the proof there's a happy, joyful God, a bountiful God, a generous God. Milk!
Oh, my God! That's milk! That's milk! Milkomania is running wild!
And then there is an amazing kind of made-for-TV movie with Bette Davis playing Aimee's mother, Minnie, and Faye Dunaway playing Aimee, which worth looking up because Faye Dunaway is incredible. And there's little bits of it all over the internet. And kind of famously after that, Bette Davis said that the worst person she ever worked with was Faye Dunaway on that project. So.
On June 18th, 1 month after Mrs. McPherson's disappearance, did the coroner for Los Angeles County refuse your request for a death certificate?
He did.
But Mother Kennedy decided to overrule the coroner and hold a gigantic memorial fundraising benefit anyway. Is that not so?
There were memorial services held for Sister on Sunday, June 20th.
A little while and you shall not see me. And again in a little while You shall see me, because I go to the Father. Verily, verily, I say, you shall weep and lament, but the world shall rejoice. Yes, you shall be sorrowful, but your sorrow shall have turned into joy.
Again, that's a testament to how deep and layered the story of Aimee Semple McPherson is. There is still mystery with this woman's life and legacy to be found even at the end of your book. I love that it's a biography that doesn't answer all of the questions I have. I was left wanting more and probably not getting much just because of how old the story is, but at the same time, so many people involved with her story and so many interpretations of it that you could really just dig into it forever. It's just incredible. And that kind of leads me in well to my last question here that I have for you, which is, given how titanic her influence was, not just in her time, but leading now 100 years later, her church still stands. The first woman, I believe it was either in the US or the world, to acquire a radio license. The biggest act in Hollywood during what many consider to be Hollywood's golden era. Why is she not more well known, do you think? Why do you think that despite all of this, she is still a bit of a niche figure in American religious history?
Yeah, and I think the third part of the book kind of answers some of that question. You know, she became a joke. She became a punchline. She became incredibly famous and then really dragged down by her scandal and her fame. And so I think that she was known for the generation that lived with her, and then she became kind of erased. And some of that is self-inflicted. She definitely was sabotaging herself, but I also think there were powers that be that wanted her to be a joke. And that's kind of the complexity of the story, you know, what I think actually makes her so interesting and, you know, such a great person to dive into is she was not good or bad. And I don't think that there have been a lot of female figures in American religious or American history, frankly, who are allowed to be complicated in that way. You know, I often mention like Hamilton, right? Like Alexander Hamilton is this, like, you know, he's got this giant biography and everybody knows who he is in this play and he's kind of celebrated. But he did a lot of really messed up stuff, but he's allowed to be this kind of forefather. And I would hope, like, I wrote this book when my daughters were young and I felt this feeling of like, it would be cool to have a woman that is part of kind of the American historical landscape who was kind of complicated, you know, like lustful and made mistakes and did stupid stuff, but also was incredibly powerful. And I like that about her. I think I don't know if she's relatable, but she's interesting. And I think it's certainly an interesting story to read if you are ambitious. It's a bit of a cautionary tale.
Well, Jen and I often talk about one of our favorite things on the channel and doing the work that we do is being able to kind of show people a different side of religious figures from American history in particular. We were always happy to show people the different sides of Tammy Faye Baker, and I think that I kind of see a lot of parallels in Aimee's story as well to Tammy Faye, that this is someone who, like you said, became a joke in the American zeitgeist, and tragically so. Not necessarily the cleanest figure, not necessarily perfect by any stretch, may not even have lived up to their own ideals all the time, but had something to say, did stuff nobody else was doing, and really just should be talked about more. So I want to thank you for putting so much effort into this story. It really does absolutely leap off the page. It's hard to remember you're reading a biography. It feels like a noir thriller of the highest order, and we sincerely appreciate you involving us in this process. Just to let everyone know, Sister Sinner comes out on April 22nd. As we always say, go request a copy at your library, then buy your own, because that's the best way to do it. If this comes out when I think it will, this will be coming out a few days early, so you might have to scope it out a couple days in advance. Claire, where can people find the book?
I mean, everywhere books are sold. They can find it on Amazon or their own independent bookstores, you know, Target, Barnes and Noble, everywhere you buy books. And it's always great for me if you buy the book early. And I'm so appreciative of you guys engaging in this.
Our pleasure. And I also will post a link in the description, but there was a lovely little excerpt, lead in, I guess you'd say, published recently in Vanity Fair. So if you'd like a little taste of what Sister Sinner will bring you if you purchase or check it out, that would be a great place to start. But in the meantime, Claire, thank you so much for sitting down with us. And until next time, we will see you all soon. Hey everybody, King James here. I forgot to record an outro with Claire, so I'm just going to do one right now. Thank you all so much, as always, for taking the time to watch one of our videos. We love making them, but we cannot do it without you all. And that's kind of what I wanted to say. If you like what we do here at Fundy Fridays and you wanted to help us keep making these videos, I would highly encourage you to take a look at our official Fundy Fridays Patreon or YouTube memberships. There are $1 and $3 tiers on both, although they both do the same thing. It's just about how much money you might want to give. We know times are real hard out there for lots and lots of folks, and we're not trying to break anyone's bank. We just want to keep making our videos, and we want to give you all extra features for helping us do that. Becoming a member gets you access to things like our official Fundy Fridays Discord. Right around 6,000 members strong right now. Some of the coolest, most interesting people you'll ever meet talking about the coolest, most interesting stuff you've ever heard. It's an incredible time. We also do weekly watch parties, everything from old Duggar episodes to modern Christian movies, and hey, sometimes even just pro wrestling. We also have several bonus videos, some behind-the-scenes content available that's patron exclusive, along with some occasional live streams that we do just for patrons as well. So if you like what we do here, again, I highly encourage you to take a look at that. We try to keep it super affordable, super available, and in turn, we try to give you some good bang for your buck. If you want to support us but don't like joining groups though, I highly encourage you to also take a look at fundyfridays.shop. We've got all kinds of cool stuff there, some brand new t-shirts, new posters, including the all-new Attack of the Jezebel Spirit poster from our lovely partner artist, Sophie McMahon, Dreaming of Johnny. And otherwise, if you don't have any financial support to spare, please know that is always fine, and it always will be. If you want to help us out a little more in a free way, please take a moment to subscribe if you haven't already. Hit that little bell icon if you haven't already so that you hear about our new videos right when they come out. But if you can't do any of that, please just know, as always, your viewership on this video is enough. And in the meantime, we're coming back next week with another big, classic, gen-sweeping epic. I cannot wait for you all to see that. I'm glad we had something in the meantime. And otherwise, I just hope you all have a great rest of your day, your week, your month, your year. I love you all so much. We love you all so much. Thank you, and good night.